Hi everyone, thank you for joining with us today. We're just going to wait another moment for a few more folks to sign on. Thanks. Hi everyone, welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Principal Analyst Chris Antlitz will be discussing leading Webscales tackle the connectivity problem, CSP business model under threat. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio control, Q&A, speaker bios, and our survey. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a replay link as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in On24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Chris to begin the webinar.
Great, thanks Sarah, and welcome everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the Webscales and what they're doing in the connectivity domain. This is a topic that we've been covering at TBR for almost a decade now. Started with Google Fiber and Facebook's Internet.org initiative. And when we started to see those things materializing in the market, we were thinking that this could be big. And we've been tracking this market ever since. And this webinar is extremely interesting. And I had a great time putting this together because I think we're reaching a point where this is going to get big magnitude impact in the market. And the content we're going to be sharing today is a derivative of our report on the Webscale market. It is called the Webscale ICT Market Landscape. So that's where I took this information from. And just so that everybody's aware, there's a much broader report that has a lot more depth to it that this is based off of. So with that, we're going to jump right in. This is me, Principal Analyst, Telecom Practice at TBR. We cover the telecom ecosystem at TBR, and that includes the telcos, the cablecos, the Webscales. We include Webscales in our scope of the telecom domain. And I think you'll see why when we're done with, by the time we're done with this webinar. And my email's there. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments. So before we jump into the material, I do want to just talk about the portfolio we have here in my group. We have over 20 reports in our syndicated portfolio covering individual vendors, operators, And we also have market-specific topic reports in the areas of 5G, NFV-SDN, edge computing, IoT, and we're going to be launching new research in private cellular networks starting next year and looking at private 5G and how enterprises are looking to consume 5G, not using the telco. That's the spin that we're putting on it. So keep an eye out. We're going to be doing a webinar on that topic as well. Okay, so contents of what we'll be discussing today is as follows. We're going to start off with taxonomy. What is a web scale? That's what we're going to start with. We're going to set the stage. I'm going to give a whole bunch of examples of what's going on in the market and talk about those, some of them. We're going to look at web scale strategies in the connectivity domain. We're going to look at how they're positioning themselves in the connectivity domain. We're going to look at key trends that we're seeing. And we're going to look at the rationale behind why a web scale would want to become a CSP. We're going to get a little predictive there. And some of those things are not imminent, but we'll be talking a little bit about, in the years ahead, how we see web scales increasingly encroaching in the telecom domain. And then we'll open it up for Q&A after that. So, what is a web scale? So there's different names that this group of companies is called. You might have heard of them referred to as hyperscalers or internet content providers. It's all basically the same thing. An internet-based digital platform company that operates ICT environments on a large scale. That is what we are talking about in this webinar. So in our research, we focus on 9 web scales. Obviously, there's many. There's several hundred web scales around the world that meet that definition. We only look at 9, and there's a reason for that. There's only 9 that we've identified that will play in the end-to-end digital lifestyle ecosystem that we think they are building. And those 9 companies are Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft. Those are all US-based. Rakuten in Japan, and the 3 Chinese web scales, the BATs, Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent. So the scope of the research we're going to be talking about today is squarely focused on those 9 companies. If I'm missing any, if you think any should be included outside of these 9, please send me an email. We're always open to disruptive forces that are going on, and making sure that our research is well-rounded in what we're covering here. Okay, so setting the stage. Web scales have a vested interest in connectivity, and connectivity is the lifeblood, it's the foundation, it is critical for their business model, for their very existence. And historically, what we've seen is web scales have relied on incumbent CSPs. CSP is communication service provider for their connectivity needs. But we have noted a dramatic shift over the past decade. I would say it's gaining steam over the last few years, right? Where we're seeing the web scales taking a more direct ownership and control stance in the connectivity domain because of how critical it is for their businesses and where they want to take those businesses. So we're seeing the telcos getting marginalized. And we're going to talk about different permutations of that in subsequent slides, but big picture is web scales are encroaching in the telecom domain, and there's reasons for that. More than half of the world's population still does not have access to the internet. That is mind-boggling to think about, especially people in developed markets that have internet, nearly ubiquitous access to the internet everywhere we go. It's crazy to think that there's almost 4 billion people in this planet that still do not have connectivity. And there's reasons for that, right? It's expensive. A lot of that 4 billion people is in poverty level countries, and it's not cost effective to bring connectivity there. There's coverage challenges, especially when we look at remote and rural areas. So I get the challenges. The Webscales see that as a golden opportunity to bring billions of more people into their ecosystems and to monetize them. And that's one key aspect that we're going to be talking about today, is how do they bridge that digital divide? And last but not least here, so the Webscales, it's not only bridging the digital divide, it's also about bringing better connectivity to people that already have it. So the underserved people of the world, how do we bring them better, faster, and cheaper internet access? And I think Google Fiber is an example of that, bringing better service to the underserved. Look at what has happened, the ripple effect that Google Fiber had in the market. Now we have gig nationwide, right? Gig access. The cable companies have provided that. The DOCSIS 3.1 platform is gig-enabled, and most of the cable cos in the States have now upgraded their DOCSIS platforms to into that upgrade. So, and we've also had the incumbent telcos aggressively deploying FTTP in parts of their footprint. So we're seeing that ripple effect continue to play out. Okay, here's a bunch of examples. This chart is not complete. This is just the ones I could remember off the top of my head. So what I want to convey here is there are numerous examples globally of Webscales getting into the connectivity domain. In some instances, they're partnering with telcos. In some instances, they're outright competing against the telcos. Alphabet and Facebook have been the most involved thus far, but we do note that other Webscales are increasing their exposure. So I want to walk everybody through a few examples here. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time on this slide. So if you were to categorize these initiatives, they would fall into partner, build, or buy in the connectivity domain. And we're going to parse that out in the next slide. But at a high level, that's the three categories we would parse these into. In some aspects, this is about interconnecting data centers and providing direct connections to key customers of those clouds. So when you see some of these optical transport cables, that's predominantly what that's about, DCI. We've also got instances of deploying fiber optic cables that are a backbone, a platform on top or off of which you can splice and provide internet connectivity. So I want to point to Simba. Facebook is looking at this now, and they're directly funding this, and it's going to cost them a lot of money. Hundreds of millions, it might even exceed $1 billion to do this. And they are going to build a fiber optic cable around the African continent. And they're going to have landing stations around Africa. And the idea is they're laying a foundation from which local ISPs can plug into and benefit from that wholesale capacity. In some instances, Facebook is even monetizing that through their middle mile infrastructure unit that they've created, where they're actually have wholesale capacity that they're looking to monetize excess capacity on their fiber optic cables. These big transit, subsea cables. Some of them are terrestrial. And that's a business model for them, actually, to monetize that. But that's not their main focus. It's not about monetizing the excess capacity so much as facilitating their bringing connectivity to the unconnected and bringing better connectivity to the connected. There's also examples of Google in this instance. They've been building, partnering, and buying. So they've done a little bit of all three. With Google Fiber, they built infrastructure, greenfield. WebPass, they acquired a company to buy footprint on top of which they can build out greenfield. They're also doing partnerships like Google Station, where they're partnering with Wi-Fi companies like Cisco. This was recently announced. And they're looking to facilitate getting Wi-Fi connectivity to emerging markets. And there are economic models in place there where they're defraying the cost to get connectivity into the field, basically bypassing the telco. Other examples are, I would call, space furniture. So we see a trend where these webscales are looking to provide beam down connectivity from space using weather balloons in the case of Loon. By the way, Loon has been used commercially in natural disaster situations in Puerto Rico, in Peru, and there's one other one I'm forgetting now that they've leveraged that network, that wireless mesh network in the sky, and there's almost 100 balloons now I think they have up in the sky. It's somewhere between 60 and 100 balloons, and there's this network that they can shift around using the weather patterns, the wind patterns to move that mesh network into different locations. And they use advanced algorithms to do that in a near automated fashion. Just an example. We've also got Project Kuiper, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. That is Amazon's foray into the space race. They filed documentation with the ITU and the FCC about deploying a constellation wireless mesh network using around 3,500 satellites in the stratosphere and covering 95% of the world population with broadband coverage. This was announced a few months ago. I think that this has the potential, and I think this is a glimpse into what's to come, and we'll get into those predictions later in this deck, where we're going to see webscales directly getting into the telco business and providing connectivity. There's reasons why they would want to do that. Other examples is Microsoft. They haven't done as much as some of their closest rivals, but Airband, I think, is an interesting one where they're looking to optimize white space in the broadcast signals to provide better access, especially in rural and remote areas in the States. That's an example of Microsoft throwing their hat in the ring and facilitating some development here. We've also got Rakuten. And Rakuten is an example of a webscale that's decided to go and become a telco. And in Japan, they are building the world's first end-to-end full cloud native network, basically building a network in the cloud. And what they're intending to do is leverage that to drive their digital ecosystem. And that is a business model for them that's going to drive data monetization in different permutations for them that they might not have otherwise been able to do as an MVNO or using the traditional model where they run over the top of other people's pipes. There is an advantage that they think to owning their own pipes. We've also seen Rakuten not only build out a greenfield network, we've also seen them acquire some very small telcos in Japan. This is recent. They put a press release out about this. They purchased DMM Mobile and DMM Hikari. These are tier 3 operators, very small, but I think it's a glimpse of what's to come here. Okay, I think those are the main ones I wanted to talk about. There's also some I haven't mentioned yet. Apple, none disclosed. So we know Apple is working on some stuff here, and they're in a unique position in the ecosystem where most of Apple's customers are in the developed world because they can afford the products that they make. Apple doesn't have much install base in the emerging world, relatively speaking. So their digital divide, there's not much there, understandably. But I think we might see, as these digital ecosystems get built out and connectivity, intelligent, ubiquitous connectivity becomes paramount to driving those ecosystems, we might see Apple do something uncharacteristic. Also, in China, I do need to talk about the bats. You'll notice they're not doing much there. It's mostly DCI and leveraging their existing optical transport cabling infrastructure. But they tend to work with the telcos, not against the telcos. So there is more of a symbiotic relationship there where they leverage existing telco infrastructure and they piggyback on top of that to drive their ecosystem development. Not unlike what has been going on historically, but I think that in China, there is more of an acceptance there that the Webscales are more focused on the application side of the house, and they're leaving the connectivity component to the telcos. Now, that could change, but that is what we see today. Okay, so I want to come back to this whole idea of partner, buy, or build. These are 3 distinct approaches that we see the Webscales using to address their connectivity needs. So partnering is collaborative innovation. This is applying co-created innovation to solve industry challenges, in this case, bringing better connectivity to people who already have it and bridging the digital divide. Facebook is the poster child for doing this via their OCP and TIP consortiums. That is their main conduit for driving forward their initiatives in the space, is working with the ecosystem to drive innovation and address these challenges. Buy, so we gave some examples before here, acquiring strategic assets or CSPs. So Rakuten buying DMM Mobile and DMM Hikari is a great example of this. You could also argue that Google buying WebPass is another good example of this. There's strategic investment. Now, this is one I think is really going to take off. Not all the Webscales we think are going to get into the telco game. It's only going to be a few. There's going to be another subset of Webscales that are going to be more of a hands-off, but they're going to fund infrastructure development, and they're going to use telcos as a portal to drive infrastructure development. Now, I want to give you guys some very speculative examples of this, but I want to get the wheels spinning on what this might look like. So, Dish is going to build a network, and they're going to leverage the divested assets from Sprint and T-Mobile. And Google is speculated that they are having conversations with Dish to help fund the cost of the network build. Obviously, Google would have benefits from that arrangement. But that's an example of a Webscale directly funding infrastructure development, should that materialize. But I want to use that as an example of what this could look like. We might see Google, Apple, Facebook open their coffers. These guys have tons of money, by the way. They are minting money, and they have tens of billions of dollars cash sitting on the books, not doing anything, that they can immediately put to work should the need arise. And I think that we're going to see them really roll up their sleeves and get involved here in terms of driving infrastructure development in that way. Now, why do I think that one's going to take off the most, that method, is because the Webscales, generally speaking, don't want to have to deal with the challenges of being a telco. There's regulations, you have to deal with customers, you have to deal with billing issues, you have to deal with, there's all kinds of challenges to being a telco. It's not easy, right? So that more of a partnership, hands-off approach where they're having strategic investments, I think is more attractive to them. I think Google is moving in that direction, generally speaking. And then there's build. So we have two examples here, Rakuten Mobile and Amazon Project Clipper. Those are two examples of building greenfield networks and taking that approach. So I did plot the 9 Webscales according to how we see this playing out from a strategic standpoint. So this is how they're positioning. Rakuten, I think, is, everybody knows that they're building their own network. They're going to be a telco, right? They're getting into that business. So they are most involved in connectivity, and the focus is high. Amazon, I think, there's reasons why Amazon would want to do something similar. And Alphabet is squarely in the middle because I see them doing a little bit of each of those three, they're doing a little bit of the three approaches that we outlined in the previous slide. Microsoft, the Bats, and Apple, I think they're going to not be as directly involved as these other Webscales, but they are going to be spending big bucks in the space to drive their own agendas. And then Facebook is going to be the most partnership-oriented of the 9. And just doing that co-creation, that innovation, and sharing it with everyone, they're going to be most heavily involved with that. Now, again, there's nuance here between the Webscales, right? This is relative to each other. How does this stack up? That's how we plotted this. So we do see several trends emerging. One is developing markets are in focus. So we see a trend where the Webscales were originally looking to do this in developed markets, like Google Fiber as an example, and that has shifted quite dramatically, actually, to a focus on the emerging world. I think there's a few reasons for that. One is the GDP growth is coming from the emerging world. The need for networks, because they're not addressing the digital divide, is most acute in developing markets, and the cost part of the equation is the most misaligned. So there is a need to bring low-cost connectivity to the masses there, and I think that's where the focus is. Also, the regulatory environment in some emerging markets is not as much of an issue as in places like Europe, especially when we think about privacy concerns and telecom regulations. They're not as stringent as in some other developed markets. So, Peru, Africa, Southeast Asia, India. These are some of the subregions and individual countries that we see hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars flowing in various ways to developing connectivity infrastructure in the emerging world. Space is the next big trend. So the space race, space wars, Star Wars, whatever you want to call it, the media loves to talk about this stuff in that way. But basically, this is about using new innovations, especially in satellite technology. Satellite has come a long way over the last decade in terms of feasibility to provide wide area, low cost per pop coverage, and get a pretty good QoS on that. And we've got Elon Musk out there with SpaceX. We've got Masa-san out there with, I think it's FastWeb. Or I think they might call it something else. You've got Amazon with Project Kuiper. You had Facebook out there with Aquila. There were examples of this using space to beam down. OneWeb. I think that's what Masayoshi-san's initiative is. I'm pretty sure it's called OneWeb. But in all those examples, it's really about leveraging the economics of space as a foundation to address the digital divide. And it's the economics are getting very interesting for doing that. And I think Amazon is really onto something there with how they're going to architect that constellation, that wireless mesh in space, and how they're going to beam down backhaul links to their AWS data centers and have all of that, having that terrestrial and space-based network talking with each other to build a really compelling network. That's going to get real interesting. The next thing is buying CSPs. This is on the table. We've heard rumors of this, right? When T-Mobile and Sprint were looking for suitors to divest the Boost assets to, Amazon was one of the players that was seriously considering it. And, you know, that I think is an example of there is significant consideration and deliberation around getting into this space, directly getting into the CSP space. And, you know, Rakuten buying DMM, I think, is another great example of this. Owning the last mile. Owning the last mile is, oh, you know, there was also speculation, talking about buying CSPs, there was also speculation around Google interested in buying Zayo. And I'm pretty sure they were going to be part of a private equity consortium that were going to do it. But I found that extremely interesting that they were seriously considering buying that company. If you do a web search for these examples I'm giving, these are all speculation, right? But if you do a web search, you can see and read about it, what was going on, and make your own, make your own thesis about it. But I think that we're seeing a common theme in each of these situations whereby the Webscales are seriously considering taking a step in that direction. It's just a matter of time. It's a matter of when, not if, I think. Owning the last mile. So this is interesting because owning the last mile, you can control the user experience. And when you start thinking about edge computing and the use cases that are going to come from that, and when you think about extending voice assistance across domains of someone's life, from the home to the car to the workplace, and everything in between, things get very interesting. And you'd want to be able to view that last mile, have that visibility. Today, the telcos have that visibility. There's peering and different ways to get some visibility there, but nothing beats having a full stack and controlling that from top down. That gives you a full view, a single pane of glass view of what's going on in the network. And that creates interesting situations. And then, yes, becoming a CSP. That I think is on the table here. And some of these things, I think within the next couple of years, I think we're going to see something happen. Something big magnitude move by one of those 9 Webscales in the space. My guess is it's going to be Alphabet or Amazon that's going to be the one to do something big. They're the ones I think have the highest probability of doing something big in that type of a space. And by the way, all 9 of the Webscales have plenty of money to do something like this. This is totally on the table. it's feasible for them financially, and if they can integrate the story of why it makes sense to jump into the space with their overall strategy, I think they can get the shareholder support to move in a direction like this. This is on the table. Okay, so what's the rationale? Why the heck would a Webscale want to get into this business of the CSP game? Especially, we all know that connectivity is commoditizing. We know the business model is facing disruption by the Webscales. It's happening. They're key driver of that. I think when you start to think about the digital lifestyle and providing an end-to-end seamless experience, things get real interesting. Monetization models, you can build new models there in consumer and business. And I think that it's a natural extension of the cloud business, owning more of the infrastructure. And also there's a benefit from extending that or integrating the applications, the digital native businesses that the Webscale has with the connectivity business to generate alpha. And I think Rakuten is really trying to prove that. So, network owners derive unique data from the user base, which Webscales can leverage to their advantage. So this is about data. Webscales, it's all about data. You peel back the layers of a Webscale, look at their business model, it's all about data. Owning the network is a new conduit to generating different types of data, and they can leverage that in different permutations to their advantage. Crossing over into their digital businesses and blending those two together will generate alpha. That's what Rakuten is trying to prove. They firmly believe that this is that there is alpha there from blending those two worlds together. Owning the user experience can improve the Webscale ecosystem stickiness. So there's ecosystem wars going on. So we see this, right? Amazon versus Google versus Facebook. Who can get the most users on their voice assistant platform? Who can get in the car the fastest? Who can own the customer, right? Who can build the best mousetrap so that they can provide the best ad tools and ad outcomes to their advertising customers? This is all aspects of these ecosystems that they're building out. Owning the network, there's advantages to increasing that stickiness and improving it. And yes, end-to-end digital lifestyle. The Webscales are building this. In the report, our market landscape, we talk extensively about what is the big picture. What exactly are these Webscales doing? Why are they getting into content? Why do they feel compelled to buy and invest billions into original content? Why do they think it's important to get into gaming? All aspects of gaming, not just hosting things like Stadia, but developing games and, building platforms for gamers to build games on. And there's all different areas of the gaming domain that they're involving themselves in. Why are they getting into fintech? Why do they want to have Libra, right, be a cryptocurrency? There's reasons why they're getting into these spaces. And the other thing is, there is significant commonality among the top 9 where they're pretty much doing the same thing. They call it different things, but, Alexa is the same thing as Google Voice, is the same thing as Siri, Cortana, in the voice assistant domain. You've got Apple TV Plus, you've got Amazon Prime Video, you've got Facebook Watch, YouTube. So they have their video platforms. There's significant commonality across the Webscales. And if you take a step back and look at the big picture, they're trying to build an end-to-end digital lifestyle ecosystem where someone buys into that ecosystem and things work and it reduces friction in their life. So for something like payments, reduces the friction of paying for things. Think about Amazon's cashierless retail stores where you go into the store, you walk out of the store, and you don't have to talk to anybody. You pick up your item, you walk out the store, and they automatically bill you because you're in their ecosystem. Alibaba has something very similar in China with Freshippo. Arguably, they're way ahead of Amazon in that new retail experience. But they're trying to thread the needle and tie these things together. Having the network and owning and controlling that aspect of the infrastructure is very important going forward. It's increasing in importance. Okay, so key takeaways, and then we're going to open up for Q&A. If anybody has questions, please add it to the chat box, and I will go over each one by one. So, Webscales are increasing their exposure to the connectivity domain. They have a vested interest in connectivity to drive their businesses. They've been relying on the telcos. They still do, for the most part, rely on the telcos. But we're seeing an inflection point where they are starting to seriously think about doing this themselves. And that poses an existential threat to the traditional CSP business of selling access. The whole concept of an ecosystem and buying into an ecosystem it's a whole different animal. And it's a better mousetrap for increasing stickiness with the consumer and monetizing end users. The Webscales have the best stack, the best system in place, or system of systems in place to do that. So there's three approaches: partner, buy, or build. We're seeing examples of all of those among the top 9. And then we think the Webscales, some of them all of them are going to increasingly get into the business of directly providing network access. They're going to do it different ways, either via partnering, buying, or building. But their tentacles are going to increasingly get into this space. And there's going to be different levels of involvement, from a more partnership co-creation approach to a more all-in approach, own and control the whole stack type of approach. And we see examples of those three materializing today. Okay, so that was the presentation. So we're going to open it up for Q&A now. And I'm going to go right down the list. So the first question is, can you comment on the future of net neutrality and how this might affect these trends? So yeah, net neutrality, I'm going to make it a little more broad. It's government involvement, okay? So we all know that governments are behind in terms of evolving regulation to deal with digital. Digital is about data and it implicates privacy, and the existing rules and regulations do not apply to that. This is a whole different ballgame. So there needs to be more progressive there, and I think that could be a major stumbling block. Some of this stuff might not materialize in the magnitude I'm talking about, and the reason it wouldn't materialize is because the governments would kibosh it. They would stop it from happening for whatever reason, privacy or antitrust, whatever it is. It could happen. But my personal view is this will ultimately happen, even given what we see with regulators and some of the challenges that are presenting themselves. Even something like Libra. I firmly believe that Libra will become one of the de facto payment platforms in the world. Governments will manipulate it, but I think that from a foundational perspective, I think that we will see some of these things that are being spearheaded by the Webscales are going to radically change our lives and radically change systems that have been in place for decades. Okay, next question is, was about antitrust. Yep, covered that. How does Dish building a 5G network impact this market trend? So I think, Dish is going to build, or they intend to build a network that is like a Rakuten-like network, a cloud-native network that is using the new architecture, that is way more efficient, it's agile, it's microservices-based. this is ultimately what they would want to do. Now, if this actually happens, we'll see how the final network looks. But the theory is they would want to do something in terms of what Rakuten is doing from a network architecture perspective. So actually, I think this is great. It's great. It's bringing competition into the States. I think that we could see a Webscale partner with them potentially. And, you know, we could see that fund the network build out. Now, one of Dish's shortcomings is they don't have enough money to build a network. They do not have enough money. And they either have to go to the debt market and raise capital at a high interest rate, or they can go to the equity market. That is not great from a cost of capital standpoint, or they can partner with a Webscale for joint infrastructure development. That is a very interesting conduit there, and I could totally see something like that materializing. But regardless of how Dish does it, the fact is they're going to do something disruptive, and they need money to do it. So how that happens, that's what the big question mark is. Okay, next question is this more about data or the sensors they can apply? I think it's about all of it. The data is where the value is. It's the raw material. It's the commodity. How do you amass the data, synthesize the data, drive outcomes from that data? The outcomes that the data drives is the value creation in the digital world, right? That is what's going to fundamentally change industries and change processes, and that's what this is really about. So yeah, the sensors is part of that because you need the sensors to generate and transmit the data. So yeah, it's all kind of interworked together. For owning access, this is the next question. Owning access, are you talking wireless or traditional wireline access or both? This is both. However, I think that wireless is the best because of the economics of wireless versus fixed, especially for last mile. When you think about 5G, we have wireless fiber now. That changes things. You can spray a signal from a base station and you can cover lots of people in a footprint rather than having to deploy a dedicated fixed line to each premise. That is economically interesting, and that changes the rules of the game. So I think there's going to be a bias towards wireless. Next question is, can you talk about BAT's global expansion efforts, how that can play into their connectivity initiatives? So the BATs are moving into the emerging markets pretty heavily. Southeast Asia is a big focus area for them. Big, big, big. India as well. Middle East, Africa, Latin America, this is where they're going to be dominant players. Europe as well. You know, Europe, they are playing a role there. Europe is a different animal, though, because of the regulatory environment. I think we're going to see a lot of this in emerging markets. Africa is going to be transformed by this stuff. I mean, if you think about Simba and Quano that Google and Facebook are building, that is foundational network backbone infrastructure that there's going to be a vibrant network attached to that at some point. An edge built out, an access layer built out there. You need the backbone first from which to splice off of, and I think we're seeing the ingredients being laid down now. So yeah, the BATs, they're going to play, but again, the BATs are not doing as much as the US-based Webscales are doing in this domain. Next question is, given the U.S. government investigations into some of these companies, how will they become a telco? Will it really give them more customer data that they can use? Yes, it will absolutely give them more customer data. So the telcos today have a tremendous amount of data on their subscribers, right? They have entire subscriber data management systems that they have. They have data lakes that are massive. The problem with the telcos is that's on lockdown. They have not been able to liberate that data and leverage it in unique ways to the scale that the Webscales do, right? I don't want to make it seem like they don't do it at all, because they do, But from a scale perspective, magnitude perspective, the Webscales have the best systems and methodologies in place to put that data to use, and also build new business models around that, around those systems, right? That's something the telcos are trying to do as part of their digital transformations. Again, ultimately, I do think the governments are going to slow this down, but ultimately, I do believe that this will happen. Over the next decade, this is going to happen. And there are reasons why it would happen. If you look at the last 10 years and look at how this has played out over the last 10 years, and then you project out from there what has happened and what could happen based off what has happened, it gets real interesting. And I think that as digital radically transforms our world over the next decade, it's going to change the landscape. It's going to change the competitive environment. It's going to change the business models are going to fundamentally change. Because of that, the governments are going to have to get progressive. Otherwise, they're going to risk sitting out in the value creation that comes from the 5G era and the promises that is, promising to economic development and GDP growth and, industry transformation, all of these things. So there is we're going to muddle along, but it's going to move in this direction. Okay, next question is, what do you think Apple will do in terms of potential connectivity efforts? So Apple's an interesting case, just given the nature of their install base, who their customer set is. They are probably not going to do a whole lot in the space. They will do some stuff. They do have a massive internal cloud called iCloud. So they technically are already a hyperscaler. They're getting big into media. They're getting big into voice assistants. They're doing a lot of stuff that these other Webscales are doing. But we'll see. We'll see what Apple might do. I think that I would keep an eye on Amazon, Alphabet, maybe even Microsoft. Those are the ones I would look to before I'd look at Apple in this domain. Next question is, can you talk about how Webscales can play a role in building private 5G networks? I don't know. So yeah, private 5G, I'm not as keen on that. I think that their big focus is the consumer side and the ecosystem and building out that ecosystem. Again, there's 4 billion people in the world that don't have internet access. And then you can add to that hundreds of millions, maybe even another billion people that are underserved, where they don't have great performance on their networks. So I think the initial focus is consumer, and then, down the road, we might see more private 5G. From a cloud perspective and edge compute, that might get interesting, but again, I think the big focus for them is consumer right now. I think that the enterprise and the whole notion of private 5G networks is more of a secondary thing as an extension of their cloud businesses. Now, for the purposes of them using private 5G in their own operations, that's a different way of thinking about this. And I would say it's a distinctly different category, because if you think about Amazon, they're looking to automate their fulfillment centers, right? Using robots on the floor, moving packages around the floor, boxing up packages, so picking from the shelves, boxing the packages, having autonomous driving trucks that are transporting those packages, drones delivering the packages. If you think about that from an e-commerce fulfillment perspective, yeah, they're building private networks, absolutely. Because those drones need to be coordinated. They need a network, a robust network, low latency, high reliability network that can coordinate those assets in the field to do the job that they're intending to do with them. So yes, from that perspective, yes, they are building. I would argue they're already building some of this stuff. Amazon, the FCC, there were some filings they made where they were getting spectrum for using it at their headquarters, in the fulfillment centers. This stuff is happening. Next question is, in your example, which model or project will achieve its goal first? So this stuff's happening today. It's really about magnitude, scale, big, starting to cover hundreds of millions of net new people. 2025, yes, absolutely, 2025. This is going to be the next 5 to 7 years. That digital divide will be dramatically shrunk. And a key reason for that is what the Webscales are doing today and how that's going to play out. Next question is, there's healthy antitrust discussion here, how antitrust will be updated. Reminder, the breakup of Ma Bell. Yeah, so again, the governments are operating on regulations that were generated over the last century. Over the last century, we went from horse and buggy to cars, okay? We've had step function, diametrically, opposite changes in terms of technological development, and regulations have to align with that, right? I think that the current discussions that are going on, look at Libra, as an example. Look at Libra. Look at all the stir that's created in the governments around the world. But there's a lot of benefits to the governments to having something like that. There needs to be honest and open discussions about how is digital going to fundamentally transform entire societies, and who's going to be responsible for dealing with that, operating that infrastructure, being the watchdog of that. These things are going to change. So yes, there will be monkey wrenches thrown in along the way. We see a bunch of examples of that today. But if you look at where this ship where that course is going, the path that it's charted, I think that we're firmly in that swim lane, moving in that direction. Okay, and then there's another question here. This will be the last one. Do you think Webscales will get into CBRS, and if so, what does that look like? More private or public services? Yeah, so yeah, CBRS getting in there, yeah. I think that makes a ton of sense. It's free spectrum, it's shareable spectrum. They can do stuff with that. It's mid-band, it's attractive for the balance of coverage and bandwidth. And I think that it will play a key role in some of the Webscales' connectivity initiatives. Okay, so that's it. So I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar. And
all right, everyone, please feel free to reach out to Chris with any follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out the survey on your screen. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. Be sure to join us next Wednesday, September 18th, for Cloud Pairs Well with Partners. Thank you and have a great day.